Hey everyone, so today we are going to go over the labels for all of the parts of the respiratory system that we covered yesterday, and then we're going to just talk about the conduction zones, and that will be it for today. So you have this diagram labeled in your notes. I'm going to go over labeling it with you just over here so that we can make sure that we have a good understanding of all the different parts and how they work. Okay, so as you can see, I think on your notes there aren't these labeled boxes. This just makes it easier for me to type. If you want to label your boxes, you're welcome to. These labels don't necessarily mean anything in particular. It's just the order that we're going to go around the diagram with. So the first part we're going to talk about here, number one, is the nasal cavity. So again, this nasal cavity is the place where we first have air coming in to the respiratory system. So again, we can breathe in through the mouth, but we remember from yesterday that the air gets filtered and is much warmer if it comes in through the nasal cavity. So that's this first number here. This little line here is pointing to the epiglottis. The epiglottis, and that was what we talked about, helps protect the trachea, so that if when you're swallowing either food or water, you don't have those substances going down into the trachea, and that was that video that we watched. So again, that little flap of tissue that folds over and blocks the trachea so that food goes down the esophagus. So number three, this part here is pointing towards the larynx. Okay, so again, we always know our pathway of air starts in the pharynx, which is up here, our larynx, which is also the voice box, and then goes down to our trachea. So those are kind of the three main parts of this respiratory tube. So pharynx, larynx, or the voice box, and then the trachea. So number four here is pointing to this whole object, which is the lung. Remembering, we can see on this diagram actually quite well that there's 1, 2, 3 lobes in the right lung and only 1, 2 in the left. And again, that's because the left side of your body is where your heart is located, so there needs to be more space. So here, number 5 on mine is pointing to the rib. And again, this is the rib cage. You can feel your ribs. Those are the bones that protect your chest cavity. Number 6 is pointing to the pleura. So we talked about the pleura as a kind of and you can see that we have the pleural space here. So the pleura is actually just the substance that's in this pleural space, and that helps keep the lungs separated from the chest cavity wall so that there's room to expand. So then here, as this is pointing specifically to the pleura, this number 7 is pointing to the pleural space. Moving on, we talked about this structure here that actually allows the body to breathe, and that is the muscle called the diaphragm. And again, we're going to talk more about the diaphragm later and how it contracts. We're actually going to get to that on Friday. So if you have those supplies that I talked about in our Edmodo post, I think it was a water bottle, 2 balloons, and then a straw, that would be perfect so that you can kind of create your own diagram. But if you don't have that, don't go out and buy it. These aren't good times to be going out and buying things, so I'll show a demonstration for you guys. Okay, moving on. In between all of our ribs, we have intercostal muscles. Make that one a little bit bigger. Spell it right. So the intercostal muscles, they help the diaphragm. So they help to expand the rib cage when you're doing especially when you're doing a forced inspiration or forced expiration. So when you're taking a really deep breath, your diaphragm will pull down and flatten out, and your intercostal muscles will help expand your rib cage so that your lungs can take up more space. Okay, looking at number 10 here, you can see on the diagram we looked at yesterday, there wasn't a very good image of the alveoli, but this shows quite nicely the little alveolar sacs. So it's in these, again, that you have the pulmonary capillaries, and that's where you have the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in these tiny little alveoli. So we're going to get from the smallest part of our respiratory system, and we're going to grow out now, okay? So this is a little bit crooked looking because these boxes are too big. 12 goes with this line, and 11 goes with this line. So 11 is pointing to the bronchioles. Bronchioles. Okay, those are the smaller branches of the bronchi. And so we have these two big branches, which are the bronchi, and these smaller ones that we just labeled are the bronchioles. So, like I said, if these are the little bronchioles, this must be pointing to the bronchi. So you have two bronchi, and they branch off of, you guessed it, the trachea. So we can see the trachea here, and we have to remember that the trachea is the windpipe. So this is kind of our main branch before we start branching off into our bronchi and bronchioles. So just remembering the trachea is also the windpipe. Okay, so 14 is a little bit tricky here. It's pointing to like this tiny, tiny little space, and that, I have my label out here, is the esophagus. Okay, so that's not necessarily part of the respiratory system. Again, that you can see here, if we look again at our epiglottis, it covers right here, so that all of the food and water goes down the esophagus back here. Okay. Next up, we have the larynx, we have the trachea, meaning that this must be our pharynx, and that is also known as the throat. Pharynx. So that's also known as the throat. It's right at the back, kind of the first part of the tube. Again, if we're looking at the pharynx, larynx, trachea as the full tube, the pharynx is the first part. And then our last thing that we're going to label, we're coming right back up to our nasal cavity and our oral cavity here, is the uvula. So again, we talked about the uvula being not the same as the epiglottis, but kind of similar in that the uvula stops food from accidentally going up into our nasal cavity when we're chewing or swallowing anything. So just like the epiglottis folds down and covers the trachea, the uvula blocks food from entering the nasal cavity. And that's when we talked about if you were ever laughing really hard when, say, you were drinking something like chocolate milk, sometimes your uvula lets you down a little bit and you have chocolate milk come out your nose. That's why. So your uvula is super important. Okay, so that pretty much sums up our diagram. If you have any questions about how anything moves in here, please let me know. Reach out, send me a message on Edmodo, however you need. I can definitely go over this again. And we're just going to come back over here and finish up looking at the conduction zone or the conduction zones for today. So it says here that the conducting zone is one and the respiratory zone is the other. So the conducting zone is the pathway leading to the lungs and the bronchioles. So it ends at the bronchi. So if we're looking at our diagram right here, this is where our bronchi is. All of this up to the bronchi would be the conducting zone. And so that just means that is showing the air which way to go. So we can see that we have to go down this specific pathway, and then we get to the bronchioles and our alveoli, which is the respiratory zone. So again, that's after the bronchi. So the bronchi is part of the conducting zone, and that's the pathway for oxygen to enter the body and carbon dioxide to exit. And then after the bronchi, so just the bronchioles and the alveoli, we have the respiratory zone. This is where the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. So again, just to summarize, really get this one locked in. If you are at the bronchioles and the alveoli, you're in the respiratory zone. And this is where we have diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. As soon as you're into just the bronchi, these two big branches and anything above, so your trachea, your larynx, your pharynx, nasal cavity, all of these structures would be part of the conducting zone. Okay, so I hope that kind of clears up any issues you have with labeling the diagram, understanding these two different zones, and then hopefully with the diagram and all of these notes that we covered yesterday, you have a good understanding of how the respiratory system is set up and what the structures and their functions are. If you have any questions, please reach out and let me know.